Well, with me in the studio, Hanan Geffen is the former commander of Israel's i24 intelligence unit, and joining us now on the line, Jonathan Schanzer is the senior vice president for the FDD, the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Thank you very much for being with us. And Jonathan, I'll start with you. You know, the UAE and Saudi, it was quite extraordinary that they did take those steps to block the strongest anti-Israel moves. Were you expecting that?
Well, I did find it somewhat surprising, but at the same time, I think we need to understand here that the Saudis and the Emiratis are deeply fearful of Iran's influence across the region. And of course, Hamas is significantly influenced and funded and armed by Iran. So there is, I think, a lot of concern about Iranian power expanding as a result of this war. It's also important to note that Hamas is a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And of course, the Saudis and Emiratis are deeply disdainful and fearful of that as well. So there's lots of reasons to try to block measures that would support Hamas, support Iran, support the Muslim Brotherhood. So we understand their motivations. And I think that certainly informed their decisions at this summit.
Hanan Geffen, do you think that the summit managed to strike the right tone given the immense pressure that they are under from their own populations?
It's surprising, the decision not to do anything, which is the bottom line of, might be surprising in faced with the rhetoric that started these discussions, and or the expectation at least. But it goes in line with what we see for the last 10 or more years. In every confrontation we have in Gaza, we have seen the same phrases coming. Not this time it's more serious, but the same bottom line is, it is not our problem. We are going to help you. We are going to give you money. We are going to ask the UN to deny. We ask others to do so. But we are not going to take any actual action. And this is the Palestinians time and again are frustrated. I would like to mention one thing though, and I think it wasn't behind in the mind, the back of their heads, is the atrocities of the 7th of October. Because you have heard the one is mentioning it. It was everybody, all of them are condemning these atrocities. And I believe some of them already told the Palestinian leaders, the Hamas leaders that visited Turkey or even the Iranian, this is thing that shouldn't be done, and we are not going to be part of anything that is connected to it. It is part, we didn't see it so much, but we hear these things from time to time, and Erdogan mentioned it. Even in Nasrallah last time, the last speech he mentioned it, said, but it wasn't done by the Palestinians, it was done by the Israelis that reconquered the villages.
They're trying to walk back their responsibility for
so it's bothering them, it's things that are really bothering them.
Well, and Jonathan Schanzer, that's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, the Saudis have criticised Hamas, the Emiratis have criticised Hamas. Do you think there's a kind of a move on behalf of Arab leadership to really distance themselves from that behaviour, which they have called un-Islamic?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that speech from Nasrallah from last week, it was very interesting. He said, we did not take part in this. I think really the emphasis right now is trying to call for a ceasefire to defend Gazans. But defending Hamas is something that I'm not sure any of these countries are willing to do. I will say, though, that, the rhetoric of Erdogan, the president of Turkey, was interesting. He sort of mentioned it, and he said that perhaps not all of us approve of this. It was a bit half-hearted on his part, but he's still trying to use this moment as a Hamas supporter himself, as someone that has a Hamas headquarters based in Istanbul that he has built and welcomed. He is, I think, really walking a tightrope here while trying to distance himself on the one hand, but also supporting Hamas on the other. And I think the Qataris probably fit in that category, the Algerians, the Kuwaitis. You can see that there are a handful of countries that probably wanted a more aggressive posture and even an embrace of Hamas, even as others at this summit were trying to put some distance.
Well, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you about Qatar because a close ally of the United States, President Biden upgraded the country's status not so long ago. Where do you see that relationship headed after this?
I see some very murky waters ahead for the United States and Qatar. I think that right now the Qataris have at least some leverage because they're being seen as the ones that could facilitate the release of some of these hostages that are either based in Gaza or perhaps elsewhere. That, I think, is really the only card they have left to play. When this is over, I believe there will be a significant revision of that contract between the United States and Qatar. I think we may see the extradition requests forwarded to the Qataris to have some of these senior Hamas officials removed from the country. I do think that more broadly, the Qatari support for groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban and Hamas, all of this, I think, will come under scrutiny. Members of Congress will be looking at this, and so will the administration. I could potentially see sanctions in their future unless the Qataris significantly reduce that Hamas presence and start to take additional action.
Let's talk about Iran's President Raisi in Riyadh for the first time in decades. It was the first time in decades an Iranian leader was in Riyadh, I should say. It was interesting, wasn't it, to hear Raisi and the protesters in London chanting for the same thing, from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
What does that say to you?
Raisi said very clearly he wants to annihilate Israel. He was the only one, and I guess all the rest of the participants were feeling very embarrassed by him. He spoke very. I think he damaged. One of the damages that caused to the decision there was his speech, because it was so out of the way that we hear the Arab leaders today. I don't believe there's any Arab leaders that would take such a position of such a stand, and he was out of context there.
Jonathan Schanzer, I mean, why do you think that the Saudis chose to invite President Raisi? Is it a case of better to have him on the inside than the outside, or do you think there's more to it?
I think the Saudis are hedging. They don't know exactly where this conflict is leading. And I think they wanted to show unity within the Muslim world. But it was shameful. It really is, for an American ally to allow the Iranian president to be there. This is a man who's been supporting the Houthis, which have been attacking the Saudis over the last decade. Yes. This is the same figure that has been supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and a number of other groups that the Saudis are opposed to. So it was, I think, a shameful moment for the Saudis. I think they're probably regretting right now his inclusion in this conference.
And not just that, Jonathan, of course, we've had more than 40 attacks by Iranian proxies on US troops in Iraq and Syria over the past few weeks. I mean, any response from the US expected on that?
Well, we continue to see a U.S. responding. There's been 48 or more that we've been able to count of these attacks coming from Shiite militias and in Syria and Iraq. It's obviously clear that the Iranians are trying to drag the U.S. into this conflict in some shape or form. The U.S. response has been muted until now. I think effort, at least from my vantage point, is to try to prevent the spread of this war to a multi-front conflict. This is what the U.S. has tried to do from the beginning. This is why we have assets in the Mediterranean as well as in the Persian Gulf. It's an attempt to deter the Iranians and Hezbollah. Unfortunately, I think as long as the U.S. is sustaining this kind of muted response, I don't believe that the Iranians or Hezbollah will be deterred. And actually more weakness or perceived weakness from the United States might encourage the kinds of attacks that we're seeing out of Lebanon toward Israel and out of the Shiite militias in both Syria and Iraq. This has the potential for real escalation.
And Hanan, I mean, Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, and Iran's Raisi have killed more Muslims in the past decade than any other living.
Yeah, that's what a joke in the Arab world, because the Muslim, the Sunnis in Syria are suffered a lot. Many of them, I think, a third of the Sunni population was removed from the places, spread around the world. And this guy coming to speak about human rights and so on. So it's the joke that everybody enjoyed last week in the Arab world.
And you wanted to say something about the Houthis?
No, I don't.
About how for the Saudis to invite Raisi at a time when Raisi's forces have been
the Houthis, in a way, they are bounding the U.S. and Saudi and Israel together, creating a safe zone there, trying to build early warning system, combining experience. So actually, Israel and Saudi Arabia, together with U.S., a lot of work to do, and I believe there is a lot of cooperation as regard to the Houthis.
Let's talk about Turkey's President Erdogan then, who was also at the meeting this weekend. And Jonathan Schanzer, I mean, Erdogan has been the most forthright, perhaps, in his support for Hamas. He says it's wrong to call them terrorists. They are brave mujahideen defending their land. I mean, he's a NATO ally. Turkey is a NATO ally. Why do you think he is going so far to antagonize the United States, or is there more to it?
The thing about Turkey right now, you have to understand, this is an organization, or a country rather, that has the Hamas terrorist organization there for the better part of a decade, more than a decade now. This has been a serious problem for the United States, but it's not the only problem for the United States, right? You got to remember, Turkey has bought the S-400 system from Russia. This was in direct contravention of American guidance, and it actually poses a major cyber threat to the United States based in Turkey. They have supported the Islamic State. They have helped Iran evade sanctions to the tune of $20 billion over the last decade. Turkey, I think at this point, it's safe to say, does not belong in NATO at all. And I do think that, similar to what we're seeing with the Qataris, we're going to see a similar revision of the contract between the United States and Turkey when this is all said and done. But until then, I do believe that Erdogan is going to continue to stir things up, to continue to push for heightened tensions in the region. I will note he invoked Jerusalem at this summit the other day. This was, I think, a new one for everyone there. Everybody was focusing on Gaza, and all of a sudden he throws Jerusalem, which is, of course, a deeply sensitive issue in the Muslim world and the Arab world. He threw that into the mix. It was as if he threw gasoline on the fire. I don't think that it took off. I don't think that everybody sort of jumped on that talking point, but you can see this is where that he would like to take things in the near future.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. Well, let's take a quick listen to Erdogan himself speaking at that summit this weekend.
It's a shame that Western countries, which always talk about human rights and freedom, remain silent in the face of ongoing massacres in Palestine.
Well, we can go to Istanbul now. We're joined by journalist Ayla Jean Yakli. And Ayla Jean, thanks for being with us. And we just heard some of Erdogan's comments there. And as Jonathan Schanzer was pointing out, he did go much further than any other leader, perhaps not as far as President Raisi of Iran, to criticize Israel, as Jonathan Schanzer put it, throwing fuel on the fire. Would you go along with that?
Well, we have seen that Erdogan has been far more strident in recent weeks than his Arab counterparts. And it's important to point out that this is from an ally of Israel, one that has diplomatic relations, a huge trade relationship, whereas a country like Saudi Arabia doesn't even have formal diplomatic ties. So it certainly distinguishes Erdogan. And he's been pursuing this, it seems, out of, pure outrage. He is very angered by the Israeli response to the October 7 attacks. But as always, it's important to note that this is a crisis that he's probably trying to exploit politically at home. Sympathy for Palestinians is very widespread. And one thing that Erdogan has done successfully here in Turkey is almost equate the Palestinians with Hamas, an organization that he has long supported.
Right, which is the opposite of what many Palestinian advocates are trying to do, and say that the Palestinians are not Hamas and the Palestinians are actually victims themselves of Hamas. I'm wondering how this is affecting his other relationships in the region. With Qatar, for example, that has always been a complicated relationship, hasn't it?
Complicated, sure, but also a very close one, both in terms, again, of, financial links, ideology as well. Turkey has stood by Qatar, especially during its crises with other Gulf nations in recent years. So in some ways, I would say that they're probably on a closer page. What is interesting is that relations between Turkey and Egypt and Turkey and Saudi had been so strained in recent years. And this has now put them in this kind of uncomfortable partnership, the crisis in Gaza. But it's important to note that those divisions were really a result of Erdogan's perceived support for the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Arab world. And one has to wonder whether his support for Hamas could raise concerns in both Riyadh and Cairo about his position on the Brotherhood at large.
And Ayla, I mean, as you pointed out at the beginning, Israel and Turkey are countries with relations. They do have a strong trading partnership. Given his violent anti-Israel rhetoric, is Erdogan prepared to write off his relationship with Israel?
His rhetoric certainly makes it look like he is willing to do that, but I just find it confounding. He has expended a tremendous amount of political capital in recent years to repair ties with Israel. He hosted President Herzog, I believe it was 2 years ago, and himself was planning before October 7th. He had been planning to visit Israel and try and make amends with Netanyahu, with whom he's had a very stormy relationship over the years. So after all of that effort, as we mentioned, the trade relationship, which I believe was around $7 billion last year, at least in terms of exports to Israel. These are really important areas for Turkey, and one that I would say I'd be shocked if Erdogan's willing to throw them away. But we can't deny that his rhetoric shows that he is willing to push this as far as he can if he does stop short of breaking it.
Ayla Jean-Yakli, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jonathan Schanzer, do you think that Israel can continue to have a relationship with Turkey under Erdogan after this?
I think this is going to produce a significant rupture. I think there's no doubt about that right now. But look, Turkey's going to have to get in line. There are a whole host of other countries that I think right now Israel is more concerned with, or jurisdictions, let's say. Gaza is first in order of battle. Obviously, the escalation that we're seeing in Lebanon is a huge problem. There are rockets coming in from Syria. That's another problem. There are rockets coming in from Yemen. That's another problem. So Turkey's in a long line of countries or jurisdictions that are provoking Israel. Fortunately, these are only rhetorical provocations, which means that Israel has the time and space to deal with this later. But I certainly would expect that when the guns eventually fall silent, and obviously we have no idea when that will be, I think there will be a significant revision, once again, of that contract between the United States and Turkey. I think that the Europeans certainly are looking at this with a lot of alarm, wondering why he looks like he's stirring the pot right now, rather than trying to produce a ceasefire, trying to produce calm, trying to, maybe even use his leverage with Hamas to try to get them to surrender, which is what every country right now should be trying to do, because the longer this goes on, the worse it's going to get for the people of Gaza. That really should be the message that's being conveyed by the United States, by the Israelis, and by every Western capital. Erdogan needs to stop engaging in this kind of harsh rhetoric, and he needs to rein in the proxy that he has been hosting on Turkish soil.
All right, Jonathan Schanzer at the FDD, Brigadier General Hanan Geffen, Ayla Jean-Yakli. Thank you very much to you all.